Thanks, Lauren. I appreciate it. I want to start just by thanking the curatorial staff here for doing an amazing installation here. It looks extraordinary on your walls. Every detail, the way it unfolds, the feature paintings, I think you did an extraordinary job, and so congratulations to you all. You always kind of feel like a parent sending their children off into the world, and they're in your care for a temporary time, but you all have done an amazing job. The show looks stunning on your wall. So I am thrilled to be here tonight in Chattanooga to walk you all through 200 years of American landscape painting. And this work, which conveniently is on the middle of this back wall, beautifully positioned between those partial walls, is one of the treasures of the museum, which we purchased in 1929. And in 1929, this type of painting was not very popular. It was traditional art. It was your grandparents' taste. And we all know what happens when those generational changeovers happen. But at the same time, I'm forever grateful to those early curators who were making these purchases of unfashionable paintings at a time when they were rather affordable. Those of you who are regular museum goers know that the prime version of this painting is in Detroit, at the Detroit Institute of Arts. It's a bit bigger. It's just as stunning. It stops you in your tracks. That volcano emitting that cloud along, sort of masking the sunshine, that long horizon line, the drop off of that beautiful waterfall. It's like something that AI would have produced. If you typed in, show me an exploding volcano in a 19th century landscape version, this is, I think, what would pop up. But this painting has a really fantastic story that goes along with it, and it speaks to the way that 19th century painting took place, and the sort of reception of 19th century painting, and the mystique of the original and what that meant in the middle of the 19th century. This is a work, the hypothesis is that this work was done as a copy of the original, which is in Detroit, and that this copy was sent to Great Britain to have an engraving done after it. So Frederick Church, who is the originator of this composition, Frederick Church hired this guy over here, DeWitt Clinton Boutell, who was a pretty talented landscape painter. This is a view of the Delaware Valley, probably at twilight. Handles light beautifully. So Church had enough confidence in DeWitt Clinton Boutell that he could reproduce his work in a way that was acceptable. Well, Boutell did his best, and there are letters that Frederick Church wrote about Boutell's version of his painting, and he wasn't too happy with what Boutell had done. And Church says that I largely reworked the canvas, painting over what Boutell had done, because it wasn't good enough. It didn't capture enough of the essence of that original that now hangs in Detroit. But he also said, but you cannot say that it is by my hand. So this is sort of a hybrid in our collection. It is a Frederick Church, it's after a Frederick Church, by someone who he paid to copy this. But then when the copy came back to his studio, he said, I can't send this out into the world as my work, so he reworks it before it goes to England. Now, the other part of the story that's pretty fascinating is that that engraving never got made. And so the end result of that, what would have been the production of an engraving, which was a way for an artist to get their work out into the broader public, because oil painting is extraordinarily expensive. It's for a limited few who can afford it. An engraving or an etching, on the other hand, is much more affordable. Plus, it could be used as study by other artists and students who are learning how to paint. So it really is a touchstone for the collection. And I love the pseudo-Islamic frame that it is in as well. And this frame, I should say, is just a liner. The actual frame would have come about this much farther, about another 10 inches or more. So this is just the interior liner. But it is totally in keeping with Church's aesthetic. Church traveled far and wide to the Arctic, to South and Central America, and to the Near East. Over here, you'll see is a painting of Syria, ruins by the sea, a much smaller canvas. And that's kind of a capriccio, or an ideal view, based on sketches from one of his trips to the Near East. I think, for us, this is an iconic work, and it sort of anchored the show and our thinking about the show, which really begins with landscape painting going back to about the 1830s. So the Thomas Birch and some of the earliest paintings predate Cotopaxi, which is from the mid-1860s. Downstairs, I mentioned that one of my predecessors, the first curator at the Reading Public Museum, was a landscape painter. And actually this painting right here, this large forest interior, is a work by an artist whose name none of you should know or recognize, but it's Christopher High Shearer, who was Reading's version of an Albert Bierstadt or a Hudson River School painter. He was active primarily in the 1870s, and he dies by the 1920s. Our founding father, Levi Mengel, who founded the Reading Public Museum, in 1913, Christopher Shearer said to him, Levi, any museum worth its salt has to have an art collection. It can't all be butterflies and fossils and ancient Greek pots. It has to be a fine art collection. And so this is a quintessential Christopher Shearer, who had great talent. As you can see, this forest interior gives us all of the characteristics that we look for in a Hudson River or landscape painting of this era. It's got the allegorical live tree, and the tree here that is fading. It's sort of the cathedral that is created by the trees, the architecture of the trees that was so much written about in poetry from the time. It's got the stream. It's got attention to detail in the foreground, following a group of painters called the Pre-Raphaelites, who were interested in the sort of scientific, botanical, and geological research on the scenes that they were painting. So Christopher Shearer, who was a landscape painter himself, started acquiring a lot of other landscapes. Before I got to the museum, around 2006, the museum underwent an assessment. We were thinking, we probably should deaccession some of the works. It had been 100 years and we hadn't deaccessioned anything. And so we hired an outside advisor, and the outside advisor said, why do you have so many landscape paintings? It numbered, 250 or something out of our about 1,000 paintings. About a quarter of our paintings are landscapes. And I said, well, it probably had something to do with Christopher and his influence. We have Christopher's masterwork, which is, now this is a big painting. It is 8 feet high by 16 feet wide. It took him 8 years to produce it. It was shown at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in the 1890s. It was shown at the Cotton States Expo in Atlanta, Georgia, which also was in the 1890s. And it's been in our care for about 109 years. And so one of the biggest paintings we have is by our first curator, who happens to be this extraordinary landscape painter. This is a view by John Heil Racer. Again, a name none of you should know. But Racer was painting in the 1860s and the 1870s. And this is a view of Poplar Neck from Neversink Mountain, which is about 3 miles from the museum. This is a bend in the Schuylkill River. The Schuylkill River starts in the county just to the north of us in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, and it flows all the way down to Philadelphia. So someone from Pennsylvania when they pronounce Schuylkill correctly. I happen to have gone to Schuylkill Haven High School, so I know how to spell Schuylkill. It's a Dutch word which means hidden water or something like that, so I'm told. Anyway, so this is a view of Poplar Neck from about the 1870s. And I was here earlier this afternoon and I just heard some folks saying, this looks just like a view that's in this neck of the woods. Everyone's nodding. What is the site?
Moccasin Bend.
Moccasin Bend, okay. So this view, even though it's specific to Reading, Pennsylvania, also has this universal quality to it. Has anyone ever heard of the Oxbow, the painting by Thomas Cole? Yeah, you're all nodding. Because this is sort of the template for which Racer was looking at. And so, everyone thinks that 19th century landscape painting is all about this untouched beauty, this sort of ideal Eden that was the New World or the expanding American landscape. But if you look closely at a lot of these paintings, you'll see that industry, the Industrial Revolution, creep their way into these works. So here we see, we see a barge, right? We see a dam. If you look closely over here, you see an iron bridge and a railroad. And so all of those things are still there. There's a highway bypass there right now. It looks much better now then than it does now. I can guarantee you that. So one of the bypasses that connects the city to the surrounding area. The other thing that I love about 19th century American landscapes is if you look carefully, there's usually a point of reference, especially with the views that are panoramas. So the same thing in the Frederick Church and DeWitt Clinton Boutel. If you look closely, there's a little figure down in the left-hand corner. And the same thing happens in this work by Racer, because it gives you a point of reference and scale for these panoramic views. Panoramas were a big type in the 19th century, this idea that you had this vast, expansive view, usually from an elevated position that gave you a sort of a snapshot with atmospheric perspective. You see it sort of goes into the gray blues as it goes into the distance. It was an opportunity for an artist to convey a sense of scale and a bit of the sublime, this idea that we all get when we're out in nature and we feel sort of overwhelmed, or you see the natural beauty and you want to take a snapshot in your memory of that particular view. Well, these artists were doing the same thing, but they were sketching while they were doing those things. And then most of them ended up finishing these works in their studios. So this, again, while it's a specific location, it has this broad mass appeal that I think is something that keeps people interested in art of this era. There are a few relationships in this exhibit. Some of them are father and son. Some of them are teacher and student. And this is a work by Paul Weber. And Weber was an artist who immigrated to the United States in the 1840s. He came and settled in Philadelphia. He started exhibiting at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And he started teaching other artists like William Hazeltine, William Trost Richards, who is also represented in this show by a small, stunning canvas. This is a view of the old country. So this is a European view of Titi, Lake Como in Italy. So while the show is American landscapes, a lot of these artists were either immigrant artists who had studied abroad or lived abroad and came to America. And while they were landscape painters in their homeland, that's what they knew. And so they came, imagine coming to a new geography, coming to a new place, and being inspired by the natural surroundings. So here's an example of that. He painted in the Alps. He painted in the Harz Mountains. He painted in northern Italy and Switzerland. And then he comes to he comes up to Philadelphia, which was a hub for artists, starting in 1805 when the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts was founded by Charles Wilson Peale. I saw you guys have some Peale paintings in the mansion. It was great to see. And Sully, another Philadelphia painter, the hybrid and the crossover just continues. So Weber's nephew is also represented in this show. Carl, who is on the back of the wall, of that partial wall. And there's another work by another Carl on this wall, who was a nephew as well. So there's sort of a dynasty. We all think about American art dynasties. You might think of the Wyeth family, so N.C. Wyeth, Andrew Wyeth, and now Jamie Wyeth. But this was happening in the 19th century as well. The Peales, of course, are another example of that. So this one also fits in the panorama category. And right on cue, we see a shepherd here who is relaxing while his goats take in the grass of this spectacular view of the lake in northern Italy. So the 19th century was all about interpreting the landscape, whether it was the European landscape, whether it was South America, whether it was the natural beauty of Reading, Pennsylvania, in a really naturalistic way, where artists were striving to convey a sense of light and atmosphere, a sense of authenticity of a particular place or weather conditions. I'm looking at this wonderful Jasper Cropsey right there with that storm that is just crossing the mountaintop. So there was a desire for accuracy in all of those things. And then right around the 1880s and the 1890s, something happens, a change happens. So what do you see? What's different here from the room that we just left? What's one thing that's different? Lighting, right, lighting. What else is different? Brush strokes, yes. So brush strokes get bigger, more bold. Light, it plays a more important role. The palette ticks up a notch. It doesn't have that sort of even cinematic lighting that we see in the Hudson River schools. What we get here is sort of scumbled brushwork. If you get up really close to this, you can see just how loosely some of these passages in this wonderful work by Friedrich Mulhaupt. Again, this is called February Sun. And so the title suggests to you, like, you know, the sun is the focus. But do we see the sun? No, we don't see this. It's not like Cotopaxi over there, where we see that beautiful red cloud-covered hazy sun. What we see is the effects of the sun. We see the light, we see the shadow, we see the sort of fleeting moment of a winter day. Now, you guys probably don't see a ton of white stuff. We don't even see a ton of white stuff anymore, even in February. This is probably a view in Massachusetts where Mulhaupt painted. He was one of the founders of one of the art associations up in Rockport and the sort of coastal cities of Massachusetts. And it is, again, quintessentially impressionist. The water, the sort of ripples, all of those things, the visible brushwork. We get the feeling that he was on the spot painting this on plein air or out of doors. Not that these guys weren't doing the same thing, because they were also painting outdoors. They were doing sketches. But by the time we get to Impressionism, by the time we get to this movement that was inspired by their French contemporaries, you know, these were the years when it was still part of the rigorous training for an American to go abroad and study abroad and come back and sort of reinterpret what they saw during their time in Paris or Munich or wherever it was that they studied. So Impressionism comes across the Atlantic and gets absorbed and implemented by a group of American painters. The wonderful Redfield on this wall is a great example of Pennsylvania Impressionism from the 19-teens. What we see here is a sort of the rolling hills down to the river, a structure that no doubt is from the 1700s, a limestone building. Redfield was notorious for going out in all sorts of weather conditions and painting all day. He would pack his lunch. This is part of the mythology of Edward Redfield, who was America's leading landscape painter. He was represented in literally every collection in America by the time the 1920s rolled around. He was notorious for getting so wrapped up in painting, which he did outdoors, even canvases this size. He would take outdoors strapped to a tree in all sorts of weather conditions. And so he would get so wrapped up in his work, he'd go home with his uneaten lunch. He didn't need lunch. All he needed was the inspiration of nature all around him. But I encourage you guys, maybe not now, but if you come back to see the show, get down and look at the oblique on this painting. And the paint that is layered on this canvas is extraordinary. You can almost imagine him having to add more linseed oil because of the cold conditions and the viscosity of that paint, needing to work it. But it's laid on, I always say, like taffy. It looks like candy on the surface. And he would finish a composition like this in one day's time. And, you know, an artist of the previous generation would sometimes take months in their studio to perfect their canvases. And here we get a moment where capturing the essence of that fleeting moment is primary. Tonalism is another movement that's sort of concurrent with Impressionism. Tonalism, these are two good examples here, the wonderful Elliot Dangerfield, who is a Southern landscape painter, and the writer over there are extraordinary. The difference between Impressionism and Tonalism is the muted palette. So there's a very limited range of grays or greens or blues, whatever the artist is drawn to. It's usually sort of, it feels like there's a veil over the composition. And the inspiration comes from artists like James Abbott McNeill Whistler, who was an American, but who was an expatriate working in France and London, but was deeply influential on this generation. George Inness is another artist who delves into tonalism. John Francis Murphy is another one, and you guys have some great tonalist paintings in your collection as well. So if you go to the Brandywine Valley, to Chadsford, where the Wyeth homestead is, that tree is still there. And there are some contemporary painters who are still painting that tree. That has been there for about 350 years. It's extraordinary. So this is I always think of this painting as a combination of Impressionism and tonalism, because it's tonalist because those blues, look at how many different blues are in this painting. A little bit of green, a little bit of white, but again, it's all about capturing that fleeting moment, the shadows on the barn or the house that is there, this feeling of the sort of rising hill, a unique point of view, interesting cropping, and you almost get the sense that that tree, you can see it moving in the breeze. We're obviously we're either in late fall or spring, early spring in this painting. Now, NC is known for his illustration art, but he did paintings like this to satisfy his own desire to be an easel painter. And so this is a unique treasure for us because it is an exploration for the type of painting, not that he was getting paid for. So all those magazine covers, all of those illustrated books, this was something that he did for his own pleasure and his own satisfaction. This came to the museum right out of the Pennsylvania Academy show in 1920. It went directly from that show to our walls, which is amazing. So it's been in our collection for 103 years, and we're honored to have it. A little side note about this, the donor of this painting got very mad when we decided to build our current building in 1924. The choice of the location of our current building was very controversial because it was outside of the city proper. Everyone wanted to be in the main city park, but there was a contingency who wanted it to be out in the suburbs, where a textile manufacturer, his sort of community town was. And so the donor of this work happened to also be a textile manufacturer. And so there was competition between these two industries in town. And so when we made the decision in 1924 to build where we are now, this guy, Mr. George Horst, said, "You guys aren't getting my paintings." He was going to promise about another 100 paintings. The ones that he had already donated, thankfully, he did not ask for those back. And so this would have gone back if he got really mad about that situation. Anyway, this N.C. Wyeth, again, is one of our treasures. The show ends with two works by Liz Osborne, who is still living and is in her 80s. She taught at the Pennsylvania Academy for about 30 years, and she also went to the Academy as a student. And so these views, which are Manchester by the sea in New England, they're both sort of ethereal, colorful, extraordinary interpretations of the sea from that time period. These both date from about the 1970s, and you know the change, obviously, from the Hudson to Impressionism and tonalism to a more modern aesthetic, which is sort of balancing the line between abstraction and realism is something that, that sort of comes into popularity, and it's something that artists are still dealing with. Many of them vacillate between figurative, landscape, and abstraction. And so it's great to have sort of the continuity of that Philadelphia group within this show. I'm happy to take questions if you have them about specific works, about the museum in general. You've got your hand up. Yes?
Are the frames and the mats chosen by the artist or the museum?
So in most cases, the frames are the frames that they came to the museum in. In some instances, those have been changed. But generally, we try to keep those things with the period in mind. So if it's a Hudson River painting, even if it's a new frame, it's a sort of a reproduction of that style. So we always try to do that. Now these are definitely artist frames from the 1970s. You can spot them anywhere. Those slat frames. But yes, that's a great question, because there's a huge variety in frames in this show as well. Now that blue, that sort of blue washed frame, we have a few of those in the collection. I think there was an aversion to shiny gilt frames in Reading. It was a very traditional group, and most of our early founding fathers were German immigrants. So there was this aversion to flashiness. So I have a whole group of frames that ordinarily would have been gilded that are sort of whitewashed or blue washed in this particular sort of toned down quality. Good questions about the frames. I didn't mention, there's a lot of artists I didn't mention, but the George Bellows is an extraordinary one, and I love that it sort of links up with the Bellows in your permanent galleries as well. There's a full range of works that, and again, this show is wonderful because while it has great recognizable artists, there's discoveries to be made as well. There are some artists whose names you probably have never heard of. Timothy Barr is a painter who is working in southeastern Pennsylvania. He's in his mid-60s, and he is he's a self-admitted follower of the Wyeth family, especially Andrew, and you can see that influence in this particular work. The work is called Heirloom, and the reason it's called Heirloom is because these are his grandmother's quilts that are billowing in the wind. Now you've got this very dramatic sort of worm's eye view looking up at this rising hill with a cluster of trees, and then this sky that is sort of energized with movement. These clouds look like fast-moving clouds. You can almost feel the wind, obviously, is what you see affecting those quilts that are billowing in the wind. So it's energized with movement from an invisible source. And how do you capture that? For the artist, it's deeply personal because it has to do with family and traditions and an object that makes him think of his grandmother. And so those are all things that you wouldn't know just glancing at the painting, but the inspiration is sort of the natural world around him. If you look closely at this field, you see an extraordinary attention to detail, dabs of paint in all of these wildflowers. It is, again, it is a careful study of the natural world. I happen to know that Tim works from photographs, And so he probably did a whole series of photographs of this site before embarking on this canvas, which he graciously donated to the museum. He works very quickly. Excuse me. I know he had a gallery show that is opening in the fall, and he completed over 30 paintings in about a 3-month period while he was recovering from heart surgery. So I know some artists take a long time. They can work on a composition for months and months, but Tim moves quickly. Once he's got the composition down, once he has the precise vision, he produces extraordinary work. He does cows, he does landscapes of the Ole Valley, traditional farms, 18th century barns. He paints the world around him. He's sort of impervious in many ways to the strains of abstraction. He is a true follower of the tradition of 19th century landscape painting. So this is the most recent work in the show. So I'm glad that it's on the wall as sort of the final note of this exhibit, because it makes the point that, yeah, some artists delve into abstraction and absorb influences from European modernism, but there are artists who are working today who are following the methods that were put in place 200 years ago. So it's a great sort of end of the parentheses for this exhibit. So again, congrats on the hang, because I think it really makes that point that the staying true to the landscape or the allure of the landscape is something that still holds for many of these artists.
Could you speak about the George Bellows painting, like what period in his career?
Sure, the Bellows is from 1913, and he painted a group of very similar paintings. One of them is at the New Britain Museum of American Art in New Britain, Connecticut. And yeah, he is painting what he sees during his summers spent in Maine. And so in this case, a group of fishermen wearing yellow raincoats, pushing this boat out into sea. So there's a lot of movement, a very high horizon line. If you look at that, there's just a sliver of sky at the very top. It is all ocean and rocks. And some artists are deeply skilled at just framing that just perfectly. Some of them show you, they 2/3 sky and 1/3 land, but the ratio in that is really narrow. Anyway, it is full of movement, and it looks as fresh as the day that he painted it, which for me is always something that I come back to, this idea, like, how could that painting be 110 years old and still have that freshness, like it just left his easel? But he's able to do that. It's extraordinary. I mean, he also painted, the gritty back alleys of New York and those kind of scenes. But this, yeah, but the scenes from Maine, I think, are rather extraordinary. Yeah. So we're so proud and honored to have that in the collection. Anything else? All right, well, I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for hosting this wonderful show.